Shalom, this is Dr. Dinah with Foundations in Torah. Welcome back to this series on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Before I get back into the series, I'd like to just mention my website, www.foundationsintorah.com, and you can go there and have access to all the different teachings that I have. It's a membership site, but it also has a marketplace, and I send out a weekly newsletter based on the Torah portion for that particular week. So the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a very interesting life, and I believe a lot of it parallels what we're experiencing today. He was a very special man, and a lot of this information has come from a book by Eric Metaxas, which I would highly recommend, called Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy, because Bonhoeffer really fulfilled all those roles pre-World War II in Germany. He was a brilliant theologian, and of course, at the time, part of the Lutheran Church, which eventually split off to the Confessing Church. But he wrestled with church and state issues in pre-World War II Germany and the rise of the kind of leadership that was authoritarian, autocratic, and really lorded it over people, and eventually led us into World War II. But the things that he wrestled with in such a deep and profound way, I don't really think there are many people that think about the kinds of things he did that he was faced with. To my mind, he was sort of one who spoke out, one in a generation who spoke out against not only the injustice of the regime, of the Hitler regime, but he understood leadership in a way I think few do. And so to me, a lot of his life really reflects his great love for the scriptures, in particular the Psalms. And he was totally dedicated, really, to the Old Testament, to the Tanakh. And his research in that regard helped him to understand the place of the Jewish people in the eyes of God. And it was because that motivated him to speak out. That was the motivating factor for him in his life. So even though, it's basically a Christian culture, and he is a Christian, he understood God's view of the Jewish people, which was obviously quite unique at the time. So he was really only one that spoke out in that way. I mean, not that others didn't, but his voice was very loud in that regard. And I think we're kind of coming to a similar place in that it's not just one or two or 5 or 10 people that understand the essence of who the Hebrew and Jewish people are in the context of the scripture, but we're seeing a huge move of that today. And I'll go into that in a little more detail. I left off with a quote from Bonhoeffer, who was sort of describing what we would call modern secularization. He described it as the world's coming of age from sort of earlier religious and metaphysical dependencies, that's how he described it, into what he called autonomous ways of understanding and coping with life. And now he said, in such a world, religion was individualistic and otherworldly. And in such a world, piety and dependence upon God as the supreme being was dying out. And I think that's pretty well where we find ourselves today. And certainly we're not passing that along from generation to generation. So the idea of our walk and our dependence on God and recognizing Him as the supreme being and the bringing order to everything and the ruler of all really is dying out in our culture, certainly. And the culture today has been raised up as a God that many worship instead of our God who we should be worshiping. And we find that he was a Christian, but he did not abdicate his role and his participation in the political struggle of his time. And by going through that, it seems that he understood a lot about discipleship in that context. And what would seem like a joining of church and state, which would cause many people to head for the hills, he understood that the two were entwined and you couldn't really separate them. And to just walk away from the sort of the political order of the day, well, look what you ended up with Hitler. So let's just go back and talk a little bit about the political realities and the church at that particular time. Again, the Lutheran Church was basically the state church. Of course, it was sanctioned by the state, and we don't have that situation here in America now. But Hitler understood if he could gain control of the church, he gained control over everything, over the culture and over the thinking. So his strategy was basically to take the church prisoner first, and it worked beautifully. And he began himself to reinvent the church, and that's very important. So we, in a sense, today we don't see the sort of government taking the church prisoner, but it certainly has figured out how to marginalize the church completely, because the church in today's culture has absolutely no influence and power over over any kind of change over the culture. So the political realities at the time of Hitler basically followed what happened with the church. So as Hitler took more control over the church, the political realities simply followed, because by and large, most of Germany was a member of, in some form or another, of the Lutheran Church. Again, we don't have quite the same thing today. But by doing so, Hitler was able to remove its power and influence. And that's always the key. Take the church out and you have your way. And so the church, in a sense, not only became a prisoner to the Hitler's regime, but it became a prisoner of the culture and the state. And I think very clearly we see the same thing happening. Now, I'm not saying this is true of every single person in the church and every leader, because there's certainly many that get it. But by and large, overall, the church today has lost its power and influence in the culture, and it's just sort of retreated. And so this is a fine line. This is something that we all wrestle with, is how far does our influence go? How far do we speak out? How far do we entangle ourselves with political realities? And every generation has to figure that out. The government basically controls the sort of political correctness, and that was true in Germany and in the 30s. And it's certainly true today, and it just forces the church to kind of fall in line with the thinking. So what is allowed and acceptable in the culture then basically springs over into the church. So as the culture allows abortion, so does the church. As the culture allows homosexuality, so does the church. And there are many, many areas that we could go on. Again, it's not all individuals, it's not all leaders. But the role of the church as an institution, it was supposed to hold the state to account. And so not only did it fail in that regard in pre-World War II Germany, but it has certainly failed in that regard today. And it has failed really to be salt and light. And again, not every church that's not the case. But the result of that, and because the church has not held the state, if you will, to account, it has allowed the culture to become completely immoral and bankrupt by withdrawing its influence. This is a very dangerous thing to do, and sometimes it appears that the church doesn't even recognize its own power and how it functions in the context of a culture. It just has kind of abdicated its responsibility. So the question then becomes, in light of all of this, how do we prepare spiritually? And what do we do? And Bonhoeffer emphasized over and over again the importance of taking a stand. And I think to a large degree in our culture and time in America, we find ourselves, there's an awful lot of cowards. We're very much afraid of taking a stand against the bullies. The government, the media, the institutions really have become bullies to your position, to your belief system. And then when you take a stand on something, your name, your ministry, whatever is going to be dragged through the mud. Things will be said about you that are not true. They're lies. And certainly once things get out on the internet, you're toast, and you can't hardly pull that stuff back. But Bonhoeffer, again, the key was to take a stand and to understand the times that you live in, to face the evil that's in them, that goes on in that time, and not be concerned of the consequences. That's a hard place to get to. He maintained that it was really daily discipline, and this goes back to how to prepare spiritually. Daily discipline in the scriptures and meditation and prayer was the key. And I find personally in my own life, and I'm sure those around you struggle with that sort of self-discipline. It's a very hard concept, and it's an even harder reality. Bonhoeffer constantly reflected on how the Psalms gave him great comfort. He even said himself that he didn't feel that he was naturally strong or courageous, and I think we can all relate to that. But his gift was in his self-discipline. The result of his self-discipline, in a way, forces you to turn to God. I think really is the very key. And I think as Americans, we have a tendency to live rather undisciplined lives in many ways. So this is something certainly to strive for, and certainly not easy by any stretch of the imagination. Bonhoeffer says that we cannot reach God. I love this quote, actually. We cannot reach God with our own prayers, but by praying his prayers, we effectively piggyback on them all the way to heaven. We must not confuse what we do naturally, wishing and hoping and sighing and lamenting, even rejoicing, with prayer. So the key in all of this is we can't hope and wish. We have to have a concerted, disciplined prayer life that are based on his prayers so that we can effectively reach heaven. And so the expressions of our heart certainly as part of what are his prayers. The Psalms are the key in all of that. And certainly in the prayer service in the Hebrew, the Siddur, you find that most of it is based on the Psalms. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. But again, we must be careful about what we do in the natural, wish and hope, versus effective, disciplined praying, and praying based on what his prayers are and his desires. It's a completely different approach. I think many of us, and I'm certainly guilty of this, when we approach him, I can go through my laundry list of things that I want, and certainly they can be noble, praying for the healing of others and praying for the restoration of the nation, etc., etc. But sometimes I personally forget to approach the Lord in terms of, what do you want me to pray? How do you want me to pray? How can I reach you based on what your desire is for me? What is the expression of my heart that comes out that is a reflection of who God is? So these are things that we wrestle with. Bonhoeffer also said that alone before God, man becomes what he is, free and committed. And so all of this, the self-discipline, the taming of the flesh, this regular habit of being in his presence. And today we live in a time where multiple distractions, in fact, it seems to me almost everything is a distraction. And certainly with the rise of the internet and the technology that we have with that, and phones and iPads and iPods and on and on and on, all of these really do serve as just one giant distraction to take away from your relationship with him. And it is absolutely essential in this time for us when we awake in the morning, and I've been guilty of it just like anybody else, of committing, as soon as we wake up, committing that time to him and just spending that time and hearing from him. And if you don't get in that quiet place alone with God, you will never hear. And these are times that try men's souls. There's no question about that. These are very difficult times. We are beaten down on every side by every institution that surrounds us, because none of the institutions uphold God and his name and his purpose. And everything is about tearing down and destroying that which God created and made. And so those special times with him are absolutely critical if we're going to survive, and we certainly have to teach our children the same thing. He also said prayer is unnatural to us and must be initiated by God outside us. So that still small voice that kind of compels you, get with me, speak with me, hang out with me, because naturally we can find a million other things to do. And again, naturally we can be easily distracted by everything in the culture. And as technology increases and abounds, that becomes even more so. So if we allow that still small voice to come forth and hear it, it will call us, and hopefully it will call us to come and spend time with him through his word and in his presence. And Bonhoeffer goes on to say that praying the Psalms, we pray along with, now of course he uses Jesus' prayers, and we would say Yeshua's prayers. So the Psalms are really critical. And of course, there is no greater expression of the human heart and the intents of the heart and the travails of the human being and the emotions that one goes through that aren't in the Psalms. The Psalms perfectly reflect all of that, because the men of old, Moses, David, etc., experienced all the same things that we did, and they were able to express the very words of God. And as I mentioned, the Psalms really were the hymnal. By the time we get to the Second Temple period, they were the hymnal for that time, and so they've been inserted into the prayer service, into the Siddur. The Psalms were really filled in early Christianity. The Psalms were ground zero for the life of the Christian. Bonhoeffer tells us when the Psalter is abandoned, an incomparable treasure is lost to the church. With its recovery will come unexpected power. So that kind of power that comes out of those words that are in the Psalms. Now, this all relates back to the daily appointed times, because anciently when the temples were standing, they had their offering times in the morning and in the evening, or sort of the afternoon, where they would bring their offering, of course, and the animal would be slaughtered. But once they went into exile, for example, when they went into exile in Babylon, obviously the temple institution and structure was no longer standing, and they could not make those offerings. The fruit of their lips, the words, the prayers, and the expressions of the heart became the substitute for the actual services in the temple. So that's critical. So the Hebrew Siddur is simply a book of prayer that connects to the temple services. And so as we approach him in that regard, this is an area that causes a lot of heartburn. We certainly don't see in the church an understanding of the importance of the offering times and how they reflect how, since we don't have a temple standing, the Psalms actually reflect that. But even within the Hebrew roots movement, people are afraid of being restricted and strapped in by liturgy, and so they rebel against it. But really, again, the most of the liturgy is based on the Psalms and on the service that was in the temple. So this is one area in which this is the glue that can hold the community together, but also it will recover, as Bonhoeffer said, an unexpected power to get into to approach God in the way he wants to be approached, because that is how they approached him both in the first and second temple period. So the prayer book of the Bible, if you will, is the Psalms. And Bonhoeffer himself spent numerous hours in a sort of a scholarly search of the truth through the book of Psalms. And I believe that it's absolutely critical, I think, to recover that which we have lost. Again, it's the place of unity in the body, because if we're all praying in a similar way, that's where the power comes from. Bonhoeffer also passionately declared the importance of course, he would have said the Old Testament, I will say the Tanakh, to Christianity itself. Really, you have to consider that was very revolutionary for its time. You really I don't hear that today coming out of pulpits. And so imagine in the time with the Lutheran Church, which was truly the state church, certainly wouldn't have heard pastors rise up and say that the Tanakh was critical to Christianity. Again, very revolutionary. He also discussed and spoke out in terms of saying things like Christianity was unavoidably Jewish. Imagine that in pre-World War II. And he talked about how Jesus gave himself to the Psalms and to the Tanakh. Again, most of the references, a large percentage of the references in the New Testament are the Psalms. Again, it's critical. And he understood that the New Testament did not, in a sense, supersede the Tanakh, but that they are inextricably entwined and linked together. One can't separate one from the other. These are the things he understood. because he was a very disciplined man and he wrestled with God daily in a special way. And so out of that came the words and thinking of one man for a generation in a time leading up to World War II. And I feel that the signs are very similar. And so today, not one man, but an entire move, what we might call a Messianic movement, the Hebrew roots movement, or whatever, to return and understand the foundation of our faith from the Torah, of course, and the Tanakh, and that they're both, with that and the New Testament, are entwined and linked together. And so perhaps all of this coming about because we are in preparation for what happened in Germany in World War II, but this time will be on a scale much larger than that, and it will affect the entire world this time. So Bonhoeffer said not only was Christianity unavoidably, avoidably Jewish, Yeshua himself was avoidably Jewish. So it was very interesting. Bonhoeffer also declared that the Jews were God's people. He said that over and over again. Imagine saying something like that at that time. And he recognized that the Messiah was first and foremost Jewish, that he came from the Jewish people, and that he came for them first, and that God himself had never abandoned the Jewish people, but ultimately longed to reach them, who he called the apple of his eye. And this is what Bonhoeffer spoke to at that particular time. I think these words at that time to me are just profound. For him to speak that out in that culture and time is really quite remarkable. He also, which was in the book I thought was interesting, the idea of sin and grace, to his mind, and of course we know that to be true, was a very Jewish attitude that was part of the New Testament. And what he said was that this teaching itself on sin and grace was way too negative for the German people at the time. They just couldn't handle that. And so out of that, the Lutheran Church, that's one of the reasons that he spearheaded amongst some of the other leaders, the confessing church, to separate themselves out from the Lutheran Church. He was a firm believer in hearing what God would say, not in commending his own views. So what he spoke came out of his heart as God poured those words into his heart, and it was not about running around exalting his own views. In the book it tells us that he did not hope that God heard his prayers, but he knew that God heard his prayers. And that, I think, is a place that we definitely need to get to, and to be able to walk in that way, not wishing and hoping, but that we know that we know that we know without a shadow of a doubt that he is present with us, that he hears our prayers, and our prayers aren't just sort of a wishing kind of thing, but that they're real and they're foundational and they go forth with power, and that he hears and he responds. Now, of course, he doesn't always respond the way we would like him to respond or at the time, but that we are confident that they have been heard and we can rest in that. One of his other quotes is that he said, "To dare to sing to God when his chosen people were being beaten and murdered, well, one must speak against their suffering." So, of course, at that time, again, the Lutheran Church was the state church. Most people attended, sponsored by the state, and went in and they sang their hymns, et cetera, and didn't give a thought to what was going on to the people around them, the people that were in and working in part of their culture. They never even considered what was really going on. And so, again, Bonhoeffer was able to speak to that. It was quite powerful. Of course, the Lutheran Church was much like the church of today, and the goal really is to keep the church out of the world. But we're in the world. You can't isolate and insulate yourself and not be concerned with the suffering and the heartache that's going on. And of course, there's enough of that to go around in the generation that we're living in, with the rise of ISIS and murderous and barbaric acts against the innocent. And we'll be talking about that a little more in our next session. But this is just sort of giving you an introduction of who this man is and just how powerful his life was. His life was short, and one could say, how much was he really able to accomplish? But here we are, 60 years later, and what he said and what he wrestled with matters. And again, I would just encourage you to read his book and hopefully take solace in the fact that one person who spoke out against a generation affected the generations to come. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over shall men give unto your bosom. For with the same measure that you met withal, it shall be measured unto you again. Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Lamb Radio is making sure the integrity of this station meets all regulations required by law. If Lamb has been a blessing to you in any way, and you believe the Lord is leading you to help us financially meet these requirements, please donate using the financial support button on MessianicLambRadio.com. May the Lord richly bless you in all of your endeavors.
Deuteronomy Chapter 31, verse 7 and 8. Then Moses called to Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall give it to them as an inheritance. The Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed.